Most people plan for retirement the wrong way. They save whatever they can. They glance at the account once in a while. They hope the market is kind. They tell themselves they will figure it out later. Then one day later becomes now. They are 65 or 67 or 70. And suddenly the question is no longer theoretical. It is not, how much do I think I might need one day? It is, can this machine actually carry me for the rest of my life? That is a very different question, and hope is useless when the question becomes real. I have been thinking about retirement a lot lately, not my own. I am 94 and I still work because I want to. I am thinking about retirement as a system, how people prepare for it, how they misunderstand it, how they delay what should have been built early, and how often the result is not poverty exactly, but something more common and in some ways more painful. Permanent financial anxiety. That is what bad retirement planning usually produces. Not necessarily disaster on the first day. A lower grade fear that follows you through every decision. Can I spend this? Can I help my child? Can I take this trip? Can I survive another market drop? Can I afford to live longer than I expected? That is no way to enjoy the years you worked your whole life to reach. So I want to be direct. If you want retirement built on confidence instead of fear, there are 5 assets you should own before you get there. Not trendy things, not brilliant things, not complicated things, simple things, time-tested things, things that do 3 jobs at once. They generate income, they protect purchasing power, they create stability when markets and life both get difficult. That is what matters, not cleverness, not financial theater. Structure retirement is one with structure. And once you understand that, everything gets clearer. The first asset is the most important one in the whole machine. Dividend growth stocks, not any stock that pays a dividend, not junk with a high yield that looks generous right before it breaks your neck. I mean real businesses, durable businesses, companies with profits, brands, balance sheets, history, and a habit of increasing what they pay shareholders year after year. That distinction matters enormously. A lot of people hear the word dividend and immediately ask one childish question: what is the yield? That is the wrong first question. The first question is whether the business deserves to exist 10 years from now. If the answer is yes, then the dividend matters. If the answer is shaky, the dividend is often bait. And retirees get baited more than almost anyone else because yield looks like salvation to people who are no longer collecting a paycheck. That is why I want to be careful here. Your retirement income engine should not be built on the highest number you can find on a brokerage screen. It should be built on the companies least likely to humiliate you. The boring ones, the consistent ones, the businesses people keep buying from in recessions, inflation, elections, wars, and ordinary life. Consumer staples, healthcare leaders. Dominant franchises, businesses with enough strength to raise prices, protect margins, and still send cash back to owners over long stretches. That is what you want. Because in retirement, there are only 2 real ways to live on a portfolio. You sell pieces of it, or it pays you, if you must keep selling pieces to fund your life. Then retirement becomes a countdown clock. Every withdrawal shrinks the machine, every bad market year matters more, and the longer you live, the more dangerous the whole arrangement becomes. This is what many people still do not understand. Longevity is not only a blessing, it is also a funding challenge. If your structure is wrong, that is why dividend growth matters so much. A good dividend portfolio does not merely hand you cash today. It gives you a chance for that cash to rise over time. That is crucial. A lot of retirees think only in starting income. I think in growing income. If $1 million in strong dividend businesses yields 3%, that is $30,000 a year. Fine, but if those dividends rise 6% or 7% over time, that income becomes something very different after 10 years than 20. And you did not have to sell the machine to get it. That is the beauty of it. The principle is still there. The ownership is still there. The businesses keep working. You keep getting paid. That is why I call dividend growth stocks the retirement income engine. Not because they are exciting, because they let you live on corporate cash flow instead of on the slow liquidation of your own future. Now let me say one more thing here. Do not confuse concentration with conviction. A retirement dividend portfolio should not be 2 names you love and 1 name your brother-in-law talked about at dinner. This is not a hero game. This is a durability game, 10, 15, 20 businesses across sectors. Enough diversification that 1 management team, 1 lawsuit, 1 product failure, or 1 bad cycle does not suddenly become your personal emergency. That is what adults do. The second asset is something a lot of people think overlaps with the first. It does not. A low-cost S&P 500 index fund you do not touch unless you truly have to. That phrase matters. Do not touch. A lot of people say, if I already own dividend stocks, Why do I need the index? Because retirement needs both income and growth. It needs today and later. It needs the engine you live on and the engine you leave alone. That second engine is what protects you against the risks retirees constantly underestimate. Inflation over 20 years, unexpected medical costs, living much longer than expected, a decade where your spending rises faster than you planned. The S&P 500 is not there to pay your electric bill next month. It is there to keep quietly compounding in the background so that your future self is not trapped by the limitations of your current income engine. That is what people miss. Retirement is not only about income, it is also about optionality. If you retire at 65, there is a good chance some portion of your portfolio still needs to function well into your 80s or 90s. That is a long runway, too long to leave everything in stagnant instruments, too long to pretend inflation will be polite, too long to ignore growth. The S&P 500 solves that elegantly. You own the productive core of American business, not one CEO, not one fad, not one sector, a broad collection of large companies that adapt, evolve, replace failures, and let time do most of the heavy lifting. I like that, not because it is glamorous, because it is simple and historically effective. A lot of people burn enormous mental energy trying to beat something they would have been wealthier. Simply owning retirement is not the age to make your life harder just to feel smart. It is the age to let simple things do big work. So I think of the SP fund as the backup growth reservoir. Your dividend stocks are like the checking account of the retirement system. The index fund is the savings account you respect enough not to keep dipping into. You leave it there, you let it grow. You know it exists if life gets bigger than expected. And that knowledge itself creates emotional strength, because retirees make better decisions when they know they have a reserve behind the visible reserve. That is the hidden value of a properly untouchable growth pool. It reduces panic. Now let us talk about the third asset, income-producing real estate, or if you want less hassle. REITs, I need to be careful here because people love romanticizing real estate. Your primary house is not this asset. Your home is where you live. It may become more valuable. Fine. It may become less valuable in real terms for long stretches. Also fine. But it does not pay you to own it. It costs you to own it. Taxes, insurance, repairs, maintenance. So when I talk about real estate as a retirement asset, I mean cash flow real estate property that throws off income, residential rentals, commercial exposure, or a well-chosen REIT if you want the economics, without being the one dealing with tenants, toilets, repairs, and phone calls at inconvenient times. Why does this matter? Because real estate does something retirees need badly. It often links income to inflation. When the cost of living rises, rents tend to move too. That is important. Fixed income retirees get killed when inflation rises and their income does not. That is one reason people feel poorer later in life, even when they did everything right. Their income stayed still while life kept getting more expensive. Real estate helps fight that. Not perfectly, not without work, not without risk. But it helps. And it also gives you diversification from public equities. A tenant still pays rent even if the stock market had a miserable quarter. Run REIT can still distribute income even while investors are panicking elsewhere. That matters. Different assets behave differently under stress. That is what good retirement design is. Not one giant bet. A set of assets that answer different problems. Now, I know the objection landlords deal with headaches. Yes, of course they do. That is why direct ownership is not for everyone. But the headaches are not the whole story. The story is that humans always need places to live, work, store goods, and conduct life. That makes real estate one of the oldest income assets in history. And if you do not want the operational burden, REITs give you a cleaner bridge. They let you own the economics of income, producing properties without personally becoming the emergency contact for a broken sink. That is a fair trade for many people. The fourth asset is pure defense inflation, protected government securities such as TIPS or I-bonds. This is where retirees often get lazy because they hear government and assume safe. Sometimes safe means very different things. Traditional bonds can be safe from default and still dangerous to your purchasing power. That is the distinction. If you receive fixed payments while the cost of life rises year after year, you are not actually safe in the way that matters. You are just being eroded politely. That is what inflation does. It does not usually knock on the front door and announce that your future is under attack. It just keeps making the same dollar buy less life. And after 10 years, 20 years, the difference becomes brutal. That is why I like a slice of the portfolio explicitly built to answer inflation surprises. TIPS adjust principal with inflation. I-bonds are built around a similar idea of inflation, link protection. No, these assets are not the growth heroes. No, they are not supposed to be. They are shock absorbers. They exist because retirement plans fail not only from market crashes but from quiet inflation that compounds year after year while people tell themselves everything is fine, because their statements still show a nice round nominal number. I do not like being fooled by nominal numbers. I care what life costs, so I think of TIPS or I-bonds as inflation insurance inside the structure. Not a majority position, but enough to matter if inflation stops being well behaved. That is important. A lot of people try to solve every retirement risk with one asset. Impossible. Retirement needs offense, and defense stocks and real estate generally play offense. Inflation-protected government paper plays defense. That is how I think about it. Now we arrive at the fifth asset, and it surprises some people because earlier I said your primary home is not an investment asset. That is still true. But a paid-off home, or at minimum very low housing costs, is one of the smartest conditions you can carry into retirement. Why? Because retirement is not only about what the portfolio earns, it is about what the household burns. And housing is usually the biggest line item. If you are paying $2,000 or $3,000 a month in rent or mortgage, that is tens of thousands of dollars a year before you have even begun the rest of life. Over a long retirement, that becomes an enormous drag. So while I do not count the home as an income-producing asset, I absolutely count low housing costs as a retirement advantage. A paid-off home changes the entire math of retirement. The portfolio does not have to work as hard. Market drawdowns are easier to endure. Unexpected expenses are less destabilizing. The baseline life is cheaper to carry. That is one of the greatest gifts you can give your future self. And this is where I become uncompromising. If you are heading toward retirement with a large mortgage, pay it down aggressively, work longer or downsize, but do not pretend a large housing payment in retirement is a small problem. It is not. It is one of the easiest ways to turn a manageable retirement into a stressful one. People love saying the math says investing beats paying off a low-rate mortgage. Sometimes that is true on paper. Retirement is lived in the real world, not only on paper. Peace of mind matters, flexibility matters, lower fixed costs matter. That is why I believe a paid-off home belongs in the retirement framework. Not as a portfolio engine, but as an expense destroyer. And expense destroyers are just as powerful as income generators when you stop to think about it. Now, let me put the full structure together, because this is where the beauty appears. Dividend growth stocks create your ongoing income engine. The SP 500 index fund keeps quiet long. Term growth alive in the background. Real estate or REITs diversify your income and often help with inflation. TIPS or I-bonds protect a slice of your purchasing power. A paid-off home lowers the amount of income your whole system has to generate. That is not hope. That is architecture. That is what I love. Because once the architecture is right, retirement stops depending on one fragile assumption. It stops depending on perfect markets. It stops depending on inflation staying low forever. It stops depending on one stock, one tenant, one central banker, one lucky decade. It becomes a system, and systems survive better than stories. Now, knowing what to own is only half the job. The other half is knowing what not to do. That is where so many people fail. The first common mistake is putting too much into bonds simply because bonds sound conservative. That instinct is understandable and often dangerous. A retirement can last 25 or 30 years, sometimes longer. If your portfolio does not grow enough over that span, your apparent conservatism becomes fragility. This is what people do not appreciate. A portfolio that is too timid can be just as dangerous as one that is too reckless. Traditional bonds, especially when inflation is elevated or unpredictable, can quietly confiscate purchasing power while flattering you with steady statements. That is not enough. The second mistake is owning too little income, producing capital. I have seen people retire with large portfolios heavily skewed toward growth names that pay nothing. Then retirement begins. And every year they must sell shares to live. That turns volatility into a direct threat. One bad sequence of market returns early in retirement can permanently damage that structure. Income assets matter because they create a paycheck replacement. Money comes in without needing to sell the machine itself. That is stability. The third mistake is retiring with a mortgage. I have already said this, but it deserves repeating because repetition is kindness when the truth matters. A big housing payment in retirement forces the whole portfolio to work harder. That can push people into riskier choices just when they should be simplifying. The fourth mistake is lack of diversification. Some people go all stocks, some go all real estate. Some sit in safe assets and slowly dissolve to inflation. Concentration can look intelligent right until the one thing you concentrated in decides to teach humility. Retirement is not the stage of life to be taught that lesson the hard way. The fifth mistake is the one that cannot be solved elegantly at the end. Starting too late. This is the hardest truth in the whole subject. Retirement planning is not forgiving. Compounding needs time. Dividend growth needs time. Real estate equity building needs time. Mortgage elimination needs time. The broad market works best with time. You cannot compress 20 years of good structure into 4 desperate years of catching up. That is arithmetic, not pessimism. That is why younger people need to hear this much earlier than they usually do. If you are in your 30s, time is carrying you. Use it. If you are in your 40s, earning power is still strong enough to build deliberately. Use it. If you are in your 50s, urgency needs to replace vague good intentions. Use it. And if you are in your 60s without structure, then the answer may be painful but still honest. You may need to work longer, simplify harder, and abandon fantasies faster. There is no shortcut that replaces compounding years. Now let me make this painfully practical. If I were in my 30s, I would focus first on building the index fund and the dividend engine, while living below my means and keeping housing under control. If I were in my 40s, I would add income, real estate or REIT exposure, accelerate dividend investing, and make mortgage reduction a serious mission. If I were in my 50s, I would be tightening the whole structure, adding inflation defense, and making absolutely sure housing is headed toward low cost or fully paid off by retirement. The sequence matters always. And if you are already close to retirement, then start with the obvious next move. Buy your first dividend stock or fund. Open the low-cost index position. Research REITs. If direct real estate is not for you, buy some inflation protection. Make one extra mortgage payment. You do not need one giant heroic act. You need repeated intelligent acts. That is how good retirements are built. Quietly, patiently, deliberately. I have watched a lot of retirements in my life. The good ones are not usually the flashiest. They are the ones where the person enters retirement calm. Not because they guessed every market move correctly, because the structure does not require guessing. That is the whole goal. Eliminate the need for heroics. A strong retirement system absorbs shocks. When markets fall, the dividend businesses keep paying. When inflation rises, real estate and inflation-protected securities respond. When you live longer than you expected, the growth bucket keeps compounding. When life throws a surprise, lower housing costs and liquidity keep you breathing. That is dignity. That is control. That is what most people actually want when they say they want a good retirement. Not luxury, security, peace, freedom from being scared of every number. That is why I am so insistent about these 5 assets. Not because they are exciting, because they cover different risks, and retirement is not ruined by one risk. It is ruined when too many risks line up and the structure underneath you is too weak to hold. If you build the right structure early enough, you reduce the odds of that immensely. So if I had to reduce the entire subject to one simple sentence, it would be this: retirement is not secured by optimism. It is secured by assets that do specific jobs before you need them. That is the real lesson. Not more information, not more commentary action. Build one layer, then another, and keep going until the system is strong enough that retirement stops looking like a cliff and starts looking like what it should have been all along. A phase of life built on confidence instead of fear.